Just do it. It'll turn out okay. And welcome to the Time of Caffeine, a podcast where we talk about stuff. If you haven't hit that subscribe button and thumbs up yet, do it now. Or Julian here will come to your house and get rid of you. He's a dragon after all.
Well, hello everyone.
How have you been?
I've been doing okay. The kids finish up school next week, so that's about to be a lot more busy.
So they have a late start, late end for school.
Yeah, they go September to June.
Yeah. I way back in the ancient days, my last day of school was the first week of June.
When my grandmother was going to school, the first day of school was almost always on her birthday. She grew up in California, and they always went to school starting the day after the anniversary of California statehood. California statehood is September 9th. My grandmother's birthday was September 10th.
So ours was just usually a week around Labor Day, a week before the week of.
Yeah, ours was usually like a week or two after. I don't know when the change. Obviously, sometime between like the 1920s and the 1980s, they made that change. But I heard that when I was growing up. I was like, "Oh, poor grandma."
Yeah, July was the only month was the only month we ever completely off. End of August we started school. End of June we ended school. So July was the only month we had off completely.
No wow, we always had both July and August fully off, and the kids do here too. So, they have a day and a half of school next week. They have all day on Monday and then half day on Tuesday, and then they're done.
But speaking of the olden times, this is what we're talking about today.
My grandma did some acting during this era. I don't think she did any movies, but she was on the stage in LA back in the 1930s.
Now, before this, was there less censorship or?
So, I've got a whole slide about that, but before the code, there was no centralized censorship. So, the phrase "banned in Boston" dates from around this time because Boston, for both books and movies, had much tougher censorship laws than a lot of other places. So you could have a movie that you could watch in Seattle or, Milwaukee or whatever that would be completely banned in Boston. You couldn't watch it there. Some places had no film censorship, some had strict censorship, some had mild censorship. It was all over the map.
So it's kind of like a states' right thing. It's the states.
Even more complicated than states' right. It's more like sales tax. In Washington State, sales tax is set by county. In Oregon, there is no sales tax. So when you drive from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington, you pass through like 8 or 10 different sales taxes. And it's the same principle with censorship up into 1934.
But then they started getting together and like we got at least one guy did, or maybe they all did.
Well, it was part of it was there were some major scandals off screen. The one that everyone talks about is there was an actor. They hated the nickname Fatty. On screen, he was Fatty. In person, he was named Roscoe Arbuckle. And there was a party and a woman who was at the party died. And to this day, we don't really know what killed her. It could have been her appendix bursting. It could have been bad alcohol at the party. It could have been any number. Nobody knows what killed this woman. But the word got out that what had killed her was that Fatty, Roscoe, who was 200 and something, 300 pounds, and it was in his contract he had to keep the weight on, had forcibly violated this woman, both himself and, according to legend, with a bottle, and it's this whole thing. And supposedly she died of peritonitis or from literally being crushed by this man. This was not true. There is no evidence to support this, and quite a lot to suggest they were never even really in the same room at the same time at this party. He had 3 hung juries. They put him on trial 3 times. And after, I think he was acquitted the 3rd time. And people still didn't want him on screen because he was a symbol of how corrupt Hollywood was. So there was that, and there was at least one actor who died of a heroin overdose. And there was a lot of stuff going on. I'm not going to lie to you. 1920s Hollywood was a bit insane.
So by 1934, did we have sound yet, or were they still silent movies?
Sound comes, the first movie with a fully synchronized soundtrack is 1927's The Jazz Singer. I've seen The Jazz Singer. It's okay. There's a lot less talking than people think there is. There's very little dialogue in the movie. Partially because sound quality was still not very good yet. But the stretch from 1927 to 1934 is what's called the pre-code era. And it's when we had sound movies, but they weren't limited the way they would be with the start of the Hays Code.
And what about color? When was color introduced?
So there's a lot of answers to that.
Okay.
Because a lot of early movies were hand tinted. So, and I mean, imagine how exhausting this job would have to be. They would paint the individual strips of film. Now, you wouldn't get the way you see a colorized movie now, and everything is filled in with proper. My sister once saw a Frank Sinatra movie where they'd colorized his eyes brown. But theoretically proper colors. That wasn't what they were doing here. It was more like, oh, there's a fire in this scene, so we're going to tint the whole frame vaguely red and things like that. So you get that, and that starts fairly early. Technicolor, they were sort of experimenting with actual color film in the 20s, and it really starts taking off in the 30s. The first major Technicolor film in Hollywood, I believe, is 1936. Pretty sure it's The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty sure the movies had color way before TV did.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, TV hadn't even been invented yet. TV starts coming in the 1920s, but it wasn't even a really thing. It wasn't even really a thing until the 40s. We'll actually get a little bit into TV because it's one of the things that was killing the Hays Code. Later in the code, it was, if I could see all of this on TV, why should I go to the movies? Which is something that the movies have been battling for 70 years now. But, if you want to go to my next slide there.
All right.
So pre-code. The one that we haven't really covered yet is that in 1915 there was a Supreme Court ruling, Mutual Film Corporation versus the Industrial Commission of Ohio, ruled that movies as a business had no free speech protections.
That's us. I'm Ohio.
Yes! And someone in Ohio was like, well, I don't think the movie should be able to say whatever they want to because they're a business, not an art.
Now, question. Was this after they got rid of what was, I think it was Edison's monopoly on film for a long time?
Edison's monopoly was basically broken by everybody going to Hollywood. The reason Hollywood became a film mecca, in part, is that Edison was based in New Jersey. And so everybody went to as far away as they could from Edison and his lawyers. And it's worth noting that some of the patents that Edison was trying to enforce, he did not, in so many words, own. And y'all, I still sneak food into the movie. I'm not, I'm not going to lie about that. I carry a large purse. I'm a mom.
Yeah, it's harder for me. It's easier in the wintertime when I have a jacket with inside pockets.
Yes.
But when I'm in the summertime, it melts in my pocket. It melts in my pants pocket, so I don't do that anymore in the summertime.
Yeah.
The hard way.
Yeah, no, I have a mom purse, so I can smuggle out. There's a great book, Kevin Murphy of Mystery Science Theater 3000 and Riff Tracks did a book where he talks about going to a movie in the theater, for given definition of theater a few times, but in a theater, every single day for a year. His family smuggled in an entire Thanksgiving dinner. And they had his niece or something was like 3 or 4 years old. And they told her that if they were asked to leave, then they were going to leave because this was against the rules. But the manager of the theater just sort of stared at them when he came in to check out the theater. They had a folding table and had spread out an entire Thanksgiving dinner in the front row of the theater. The manager just kind of looked at them and walked away.
Like, nope, not dealing with this.
Yep, like, nope, I'm good, thank you. But, yeah, so... And the funny thing is movies didn't even used to sell food. In the early days, you'd have popcorn vendors outside the theater who weren't connected with the theater. And then they were like, hey, we could be making that money. So it used to be everybody brought in their own food because the theater didn't sell anything. But yeah, so the movies weren't considered to be an art. They were a business, which meant they had no First Amendment protection, which meant the government could legally censor movies.
Unlike today, where businesses are people.
Right. And so the film industry started to fear nationwide censorship. Where it would be federal law what they could and couldn't put on screen. And given what was going on in the 1920s worldwide, you can kind of understand the fear there. And yeah, they would have to sometimes release even just different cuts. And there were some movies you just wouldn't even bother trying. So one of the words we're going to get to later, one of my slides, a series of slides has the entire production code on it. And one of the words we're going to get to later is miscegenation. So if your movie had a white character and a character of color, no matter what color, you just did not send that movie to the South.
Kind of like what they do in, say, China or whatever. They cut things out or they
yeah.
Or whatever.
Same basic situation that we have worldwide now, was nationwide in the teens and 20s. And yeah, the price of movie tickets has been going up way faster than inflation. It's a whole thing. And the reason movie food is so expensive is because of how the studios take a cut out of, the first weekend box office, the studios get something like 90%. And the theater is trying to pay rent and pay for employees and so forth on that remaining 10%. And that's why they overcharge for popcorn and sodas, because that's what's paying their rent. It's an if I ruled the world thing where I would fix this whole situation. But this is why it is what it is. So next slide, please.
Okay.
So, this is William H. Hayes, who was brought in to run the original production code and then the full-on one that actually accomplished anything. He was Warren G. Harding's Postmaster General. I don't know how many of you know what Teapot Dome was, but it was the big political scandal of its day. It's kind of hard to explain what it's about. It has to do with oil leases. It's a whole thing. If you've ever seen There Will Be Blood, that kind of ties into Teapot Dome. In the documentary The Celluloid Closet, Gore Vidal, I love listening to Gore Vidal, is talking about Will Hayes, and he, number one, says he looks not unlike Mickey Mouse, which, if you look at your picture there, not wrong. He also referred to him as one of the rare unindicted members of Warren G. Harding's cabinet. The Harding administration was the most corrupt administration of the 20th century. And they brought him in to be the chairman of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. Now, at the time, there had just been a Supreme Court ruling that separated production and distribution. Before that, the studios owned the theaters. And this was no longer true, so it was all getting kind of complicated with who owned what, and the history of who owns what in the movies and what current Supreme Court legislation holds is kind of fascinating. But this is a time that the studios and the theaters are starting to be a bit more separated. And
Sorry, so you said who owns what now? So was there all the studios we have now, like Universal, MGM?
Not all of them.
Paramount.
A lot of them. There wasn't Sony, but there was Universal, and there was United Artists, and Paramount, 20th Century Fox,
Disney.
Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Warner Brothers was owned by the actual Warner Brothers at the time. Disney was in the process of making and releasing Snow White at the time. Snow White is 1928. Not 28. Yeah.
Well,
no, it's Steamboat Willie's 28. Snow White is 38.
Yeah, well, spoiler alert real fast. We'll be talking in about 2 weeks. We'll be talking about the different Disney movies and the different eras, from the Golden Era to the Bronze Era to the Dark Age to the Renaissance and all that stuff. But
I write a weekly column about Disney for soon to be for Media Magpies. My first Media Magpies Disney column is going to be about Captain EO.
Maybe you can, if you're free that Wednesday, you can join us.
Yeah, I'll see what I've got going on. Because I know a fair amount about that history. But Disney still existed. It was just in the process of getting started on the thought of, hey, maybe we could make a feature. But Mickey was just hitting as a huge thing at the time.
Yeah.
So yes, some of the studios weren't there yet, but this was the big age of the studios when they owned people's contracts. And, if you ever wonder why two actors from the golden age of Hollywood never appeared in a movie together, odds are really, really good it's because their contracts were owned by different studios. So, one of them worked for Universal and the other worked for MGM, and they were not going to do a movie together. So, next slide, please.
Right.
So, 1927, they put in place guidelines. They were not legally enforced. They were not regularly followed. They were there so it looked like the studios were doing something. And some of the movies of this era were amazing because they were pushing what you could do on film. So you would get movies with... there's a lot of gangster movies from this era, which is partially the pre-code thing, but it's also partially this was Prohibition. This was the big age of the famous gangster. So you get, and I love that this is the full title, Scarface, Shame of a Nation, and White Heat, and The Public Enemy, and all of these other big gangster movies where you know them if you saw them.
A question.
Mm-hmm.
We might talk about later. When did the Tarzan movies come out?
Tarzan movies started coming out during the pre-code era.
Okay, because I was wondering about that, because I remember one scene where I think Jane was swimming naked.
Yes, that is a pre-code movie. There's a pre-code Tarzan where Jane is swimming naked. Right. Now, Tarzan movies got made for literally decades, but there is, and I've seen the clip, it's also in the Celluloid Closet, of... The Celluloid Closet, by the way, is a documentary. It started as a book. Well, it started as a series of lectures. Then the guy wrote a book. Then it became a documentary made for, I believe, HBO, about the history of gay characters in film. It is a wonderful resource. There are a lot of pre-code movies that were playing with gender roles and playing with sexuality and all kinds of fascinating things like that. And it's really, really worth it. And the movie is worth watching because, for one thing, the people they interviewed, the list of people they interviewed for this movie is amazing. And every story Gore Vidal tells is solid gold. But you also get Tom Hanks, you get Tony Curtis, you get Whoopi Goldberg, you get Susan Sarandon, you get just all kinds of people. And so there were also pre-code movies that were pushing, and that's what this era is called. It's called the pre-code. 27 to 34, pre-code. They're pushing boundaries, and they're seeing what they can do with movies. The series is called The Celluloid Closet, the book and the movie. It's basically the closet on film. Really, really worth checking out. If you take nothing else away from this talk, look for The Celluloid Closet. My best friend and I have been calling Tom Hanks that nice Tom Hanks since 2000 because of a story he tells in that movie. Next slide, please.
Right.
And these are the don'ts. These are the things that you were not allowed to, in theory, nobody actually paid attention, not allowed to do. Said, those things which, and I copied all of this word for word. So, those things which are included in the following list shall not appear in pictures produced by the members of this association, irrespective of the manner in which they are treated. So it doesn't matter if you're clearly against the thing, you just can't have it in there at all. Number 1, pointed profanity by either title or lip, which means you can't name your movie that and no one can say it. This includes the words God, Lord, Jesus Christ, unless they be used reverently in connection with proper religious ceremonies. So you can pray, but you can't blaspheme. Hell, SOB, damn, God, GAWD, and every other profane and vulgar expression, however it may be spelled. Don't try to get around the code by spelling things weird. We will know.
Like no S's with dollar signs.
Right, exactly. Leet had not been invented yet, but even if it had, they would know. Number 2. Any licentious or suggestive nudity, in fact or in silhouette, and any lecherous or licentious notice thereof by other characters in the picture. You can't look at people's nude bodies. You can't suggest looking at people's nude bodies. People don't have nude bodies. I don't know what you're talking about. Number 3. The illegal traffic in drugs. And remember that this theoretically would have included alcohol at this point.
Oh yeah,
we're still in prohibition here.
I think at the beginning of the code, it was ending.
Yeah, the beginning of the code is right around the same time as the end of prohibition. But during the pre-code era, illegal drugs technically includes alcohol. People still drank like crazy in pre-code movies. I am here to tell you, watch The Thin Man sometime. They are constantly drinking in that movie. That's 1934. Number 4, any inference of sex perversion. We know what sex perversion translates to. Appropriate to be talking about this in June, because this was the first real codified no homo in Hollywood. Number 5 is white slavery, which is a euphemism for sex work. Number 7, sex hygiene and venereal diseases, which is interesting because
I skipped 6.
Hmm? I skipped 6, yes. Miscegenation. People can't date outside their race in the movies. You can't sell those movies in the South anyway. 7, sex hygiene and venereal diseases. What you're starting to get is so-called health movies. The feminine hygiene shorts won't be for a while yet, but you'd start to get these movies that would claim they were about health topics, but really were an excuse to show, nudity and personal bits and so forth. So number 7 is basically saying, no, you can't fool us. Number 8, scenes of actual childbirth, in fact or in silhouette. Same thing. Number 9, children's sex organs, which, okay, fair.
So no child porn. That's it.
No child porn. Strictly forbidden.
Okay, I agree with that one.
Yeah, no, I'm fine with that one. It's basically the only one on this list that it's like, yeah, no, okay, I get it. Number 10, ridicule of the clergy. And that's how you can tell that these rules were starting to be put in place by religious organizations. We're going to see it too with the code. There is a lot of, you can't say bad things about religious figures. Number 11, willful offense to any nation, race, or creed. And note, you can't even show it to have people be against it. Irrespective of the manner in which they are treated, says the rule. Which means you can't have your hero, fight to have someone stop being a racist, because that's against number 11. Next slide, please. The be carefuls. Special care must be exercised in the manner in... Oh, I forgot to remove the footnote. Sorry. Must be exercised in the manner in which the following subjects are treated, to the end that vulgarity and suggestiveness may be eliminated, and that good taste may be emphasized. So this is the list from before the code. This list got scrapped in 1934. All of this stuff predates what we have now, which is the rating system. The rating system is kind of what followed after the code was removed. So there's 2 complete scrappings of the code, and there's several amendments. So, number 1, you have to be careful about use of the flag. Number 2, and given the 20s and 30s, we can kind of see where number 2 is going. International relations. Avoid picturizing, putting in a motion picture, one assumes, in an unfavorable light another country's religion, history, institutions, prominent people, and citizenry.
That's kind of almost more like a modern thing.
Yeah. But what
like
number 2 was really focused on was the situation in Europe at the time. Because in the 1920s and 30s,
called World War II and Hitler?
Yeah, this is pre-World War II, but so it is actually true that a lot of the early studio leaders were Jewish. This is in part because there were no restrictions from Jews joining the industry. It was a new industry, so there wasn't an old guard keeping Jewish people out. So, yeah, a lot of Jewish people went into the movie industry because, oh, look, it's a job. And a lot of the studio leaders were Jewish. And basically, this is the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant political structure saying, don't make movies against Hitler. That's basically what number 2 kind of boils down to. It's going to get more explicit as we go. And then World War II starts, and they're like, you know what, never mind. Number 3, religion and religious ceremonies. Honestly, I'm okay with being careful about how you present those. A lot of the be carefuls, I'm like, yeah, no, fair. Let's not, completely go nuts on this stuff. Number 4, arson. Number 5, the use of firearms. Number 6, theft, robbery, safecracking, and dynamiting of trains, mines, buildings, etc., having in mind the effect which a too detailed description of these may have upon, and I love this phrasing, the moron. Basically, it's saying some people aren't smart enough to know that you shouldn't do the bad. And if you show them how to do the bad, they'll go do it. Because that argument is probably centuries old at this point. What medium they've been talking about changes. But there is not a single argument about video games that you can't find in pre-code film discourse.
Yeah, I think we talked about that kind of in the comic thing a few months ago.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same basic, you can't show how to do this because then people will go out and do this. It's like, well, no, probably not, actually.
I know that's why I played Mario. I was all about stomping turtles, real-life turtles, and going in the sewers.
Exactly. Number 7, brutality and possible gruesomeness. Yes, we have the rating system now, but there's a certain amount where I don't want to see that. Even in a higher rated movie. That's why I like the system we have now where we say why things are rated the way they are. Because there's things I don't want to watch.
Funny story about that real fast.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I did, the same time I played Mario, it was also the same time it came out. So I was scared of sewers for a long time. I was scared of the sewer for a long time.
Yeah. Next slide, please. Technique of committing murder by whatever method. You have to be really careful when you show. Explain, Eddie. Explain movies based on paranormal haunting. Yes, exactly. Pipplepunk, the Anarchist Cookbook is stored in the rare books room at my alma mater because they keep closer tabs on books there, so it stops getting stolen. But yeah, if Eddie, if you could make your question a little bit more clear, I'm not quite sure what you're asking me. Don't show methods of smuggling. Third degree methods. Now, I don't know if you know what third degree is.
Like third degree murder?
No, it's the way police interrogations, the like shining light in people's faces and the theoretically illegal ways of getting confessions out of suspects from the police. They were supposed to be careful how they showed that. I suspect mostly because it gives you a poor view of the police if you see, suspects being beaten with rubber hoses and so forth. I'm sorry, I forgot to clear. Guys, I literally copy pasted this and I forgot to clear my formatting on some of these. I'm sorry. Because there's no reason for me to type it out if I could just copy paste literally the same text that I'm going to be using. Torture, basically. Number 11. Oh, yeah, no, the rating system is not church controlled, Eddie. The Catholic Church we're going to be talking about as we get further here. But currently the rating system is controlled by a small group of people who supposedly are parents but really aren't. There's a movie called This Film Is Not Yet Rated, which is about the current structure of the rating system, if you're looking for more information on that. Actual hangings or electrocutions as legal punishment for crime. You can show people being executed for crime, but you got to be careful in how you show it. I suspect to keep it from getting too graphic. Probably to keep people from being opposed to the death penalty. But anyway, and yeah, number 12, sympathy for criminals. Like that's a whole thing.
Yeah, so 11, is that like the beginning of off-screen deaths?
Yeah.
And then 12, you can't have they can't have a gray criminal. It's black and white. No gray.
Well, it's more you can't have a criminal. Honestly, this would probably prevent an adaptation of Les Miserables, because when Jean Valjean steals the bread to feed his sister's starving children, that's a fully sympathetic motive, and you can't have that. And to be fair, this does say you have to be careful in how you show these things. So, yeah, there are some criminals where I don't really think you get to show that much sympathy towards them, because while it is true that, for example, John Wayne Gacy had a terrible childhood, that doesn't make what he did good, kids. So, showing sympathy for his childhood is one thing, saying, therefore he killed lots of young men, less so. 13, be careful about attitude towards public characters in institutions. 14, I don't think I have to explain to anyone what sedition is anymore. I think a couple of years ago we all got a real good primer on sedition. Be careful about showing apparent cruelty to children and animals. Branding of people and animals. There's actually a pre-code movie I have seen where Tallulah Bankhead gets branded as part of a deal she's made. It's kind of appalling.
I understand people, but animals too.
Well, I think that's more of a it's kind of gross. Don't linger on it.
Okay, like I thought if maybe have a cowboy movie, they had to show the branding.
You can show it, but this is the be carefuls.
Okay.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me, Eddie. He says he saw a cemetery in one old movie that got burned down to prevent a demon. That wouldn't surprise me. Horror movies can get weird. The sale of a woman or a woman selling her virtue, that's sex work again. Sexual assault or attempted. So a first night scene is the honeymoon. That is their very, very tactful way of saying, be careful how you show people losing their virginity. Even, so, it gets into number 20, man and woman in bed together. Be very, very careful, even within the context of marriage. Show very carefully. Oh, Nick 1990, we'll be getting a lot more talk about censorship. We have just begun. Show very, very carefully men and women in bed together. Be very, very careful about the first night of the honeymoon. In It Happened One Night, the main characters get married at the end, and there is a reference to what is about to happen, but you don't actually see anything.
Wasn't it? I could be remembering this wrong. Wasn't it the Brady Bunch that had the first couple together in bed?
Technically, no. I think it was Ozzy and Harriet. It was one of the early early TV married couples who were themselves actually married. It wasn't, as I recall, Desi and Lucy. I'm pretty sure they had twin beds. It might have been Ozzy and Harriet. It was someone else along those lines.
I know Fred and Wilma had separate beds.
Yeah, and they were animated. But until the Brady Bunch, the fact that there was one TV couple and they were one of several actual married couples you saw on TV and were the only ones who shared a bed. Yeah. And film, for a while, there was a rule that at least one, I think each person had to have at least 1 foot on the ground if there were 2 people in bed together. And of course, deliberate seduction of girls, which, yeah. Seduction of boys, not discussed. Next slide, please. The institution of marriage. Be careful how you show that. Obviously, you can show it, but careful. Be careful about surgical operation. Be careful about the use of drugs. Titles or scenes having to do with law enforcement or law enforcing officers, which is another, you should really treat them respectfully, but we're not going to flat out say that. But there was also a movie, I Escaped from a Chain Gang. Yeah, they said, I don't know how to pronounce it, the French word for pregnant was how they referred to Lucy's pregnancy for, an entire season. Excessive or lustful kissing, particularly when one character or the other is a heavy, which means the girl can't make out with the villain too much. But, yeah. So these are the be carefuls. You can show these things, but they don't really want you to. Back one. Yeah, the National League of Decency is founded at around this time. It's founded by John T. McNicholas, Archbishop of Cincinnati, so that's another Ohio.
Yay, me.
And it ranked all movies in 4 categories. A1 for general patronage means fine for everybody. Basically the current equivalent of a G, except this is about morals more than anything else. A2 for adults and adolescents only, which, as we'll see, is actually broader than you get with the code, where everything had to be basically A1. B, objectionable in part for all, and C is condemned. And
So what would that be in today's standards? Like G13X?
So it's probably G, PG, or PG-13 maybe. Objectionable in part for all would probably actually be an NC-17. And we don't really have an equivalent of condemned. Because it was basically, this film should not exist.
So A2 would have been PG-13 and R?
Yeah. And this is not, cops always good, criminals always bad. And when we get to the code, there was literally a crime must not pay rule, Which, if you're ever wondering why so many movies from that era end with somebody suddenly going to prison or getting killed or something, it's because they had to. It was actually the rule in Hollywood. Sex was just not shown, for the most part. Premarital sex was bad. Sex was okay, I guess, within the confines of marriage, provided it was for procreation. And yeah, anything illegal bad. National League of Decency was not technically officially Catholic, but in practice, it's the Catholic League of Decency. That's how I thought of it when I was looking all this up. And it was founded by an archbishop, and Catholics are still the largest single block of Christians in the United States. Okay. So then we get to Joseph Breen here. This guy worked with the League of Decency initially. He was appointed by Hayes to head the Production Code Administration, which basically means they brought him in to actually make the studios follow the code.
Like an enforcer.
Yeah, literally, you had to take your scripts to Joe Breen. You did not get a choice. The studios all signed agreements saying that they would do this, and the first thing you had to do was take your script to Joe Breen, and he could reject it out of hand right then. And a lot of movies were. Or he could go through slashing lines out and whole scenes and writing notes saying you need to change this whole list of things. He was the most powerful man in Hollywood for years, decades. Joe Breen controlled Hollywood. And because he was Catholic, he appeased the League of Decency. They knew him. They knew that he would do what they wanted. But while Catholics as a block are bigger, Protestants as an amorphous blob are more numerous. So all of the non-Catholics are like, well, I guess, if Hayes is in charge like a good Presbyterian, that's fine. And I guess, it appeased both branches of Christianity in the U.S. Both major branches, let's say.
So no Orthodox.
Yeah, well, nobody really cared about the Orthodox, I'm sad to say. And he brought his own feelings into the office, including a lot of anti-Semitism. He was openly and explicitly anti-Semitic. There's a lot of stuff, and he toned it down during World War II. But there's a lot of stuff he wrote in the 30s that 5 years later had already aged very poorly.
Around that time, I think around that time, a lot of them were like denied entry because they were escaping. So they were escaping for some reason. They were escaping Europe for some reason, and a lot of America are like, nope, no entry for you.
And he was adamant that the United States movie industry was not going to offend Germany. Which means that even if the movie studios had wanted, and some of them did, some of them still wanted the German box office, but some of the studio heads, who, again, a lot of them were Jewish, were looking at Germany and like, this is something we should be worried about. Let's make movies. But no, because Joe Breen wouldn't let them.
I'll be right back. Continue talking.
Yep, I'll keep talking. So what you get is you get a lot of veiled references to Germany. This is way pre-Song of the South. Song of the South is in the 50s. He would... My favorite thing about Joe Breen is favorite kind of, but the funniest thing to me about Joe Breen is that he had a thing about bodily functions, urination and defecation. He had a whole big thing about them. During his stay at the head of the production code, you couldn't even show a baby in an uncovered diaper because it grossed him out so much. So there's a scene in Psycho, which is after he left the office, but there's a scene in Psycho. I genuinely don't know if he's related to Neil Breen or not. But there's a scene in Psycho where Marion Crane writes down how much she's stolen and all of the things that she's done with it. She writes it down on a piece of paper, adds some things up, then tears it up, throws it in the toilet, and flushes the piece of paper.
I am back. I had a very poorly timed delivery.
That'll happen. There's no real reason for her to write all this stuff out on the piece of paper. It happens in Psycho at the beginning of the movie. It happens because the screenwriter wanted to force a flushing toilet on the screen. So when Marion Crane drops the pieces of paper into the toilet and flushes it, that is the first time a toilet is flushed in a Hollywood movie. Which I think is enormously funny. He did it just to piss off Joe Breen. That is the only reason it happens. He freely acknowledged it. So, yeah. So he was a very powerful man with his own personal biases, and he ran Hollywood in a lot of ways. And it was very much abuse of power. But what were they going to do? Go against him and have federal censorship? No, thank you. So next slide, please. So this is when we get the actual production code. And this is the code that governed Hollywood movies for about 20 years, with some modifications that we're going to get to in a bit. But this is as established in 1934. General principles. No picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. Because, a little bit of religious influence going here. Sin. Number 2, correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. And of course, it's our standards that are correct. Number 3, law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. Because we have to have everything in order, everything has to follow a very specific path. It's
like you said earlier, a guy stealing food for his children.
Yeah. There are a lot of movies that were made in the pre-code era and the silent era and so forth that could not be remade under the code. Yes, this guy was indeed, Pibblepunk, thank you, assigned hall monitor at birth. And the subjective aspect was not there because it was objectively what Joe Breen thought. So next slide, please.
What?
Yeah, and I know this is really small, but I was trying to fit as much as possible onto each slide and still have it be legible because the code kind of goes on a bit. Section 1 is crimes against the law. Number 1, murder. The technique of murder must be presented in a way that will not inspire imitation. Brutal killings are not to be presented in detail. Revenge in modern times shall not be justified. You can have a historical drama where there's revenge because some of the great story, otherwise you couldn't have Hamlet. I'm not sure how Jurassic Park would be affected. I think we'll keep an eye out for that. Certainly,
no eating people.
Yeah.
Probably.
Well, not on screen. You could imply it, but you certainly couldn't show it. And I think they'd have to restore the book ending where Hammond gets eaten by dinosaurs. Number 2, methods of crime should not be explicitly presented. A, theft, robbery, safecracking, and dynamiting of trains, mines, buildings, etc. should not be detailed in method. Yeah, no, you could not do Hunchback. There are a lot of classic works of literature that, if you've seen Code era adaptations of them, seem odd somehow. B, arson must be subject to the same safeguards. You cannot show how to set fire to things. C, the use of firearms should be restricted to the essentials. No more shooting than is strictly necessary for the purpose of the plot.
Like westerns.
Yeah, you can't have there's a scene in Tombstone, which is obviously not a Code movie. So much Code violation in Tombstone, wow. But there's a scene where, and it's historically accurate, where Curly Bill Brocious is firing his guns into the air just because he's drunk. And you cannot have a scene like that in a Code movie. D, methods of smuggling should not be presented. 3, illegal drug traffic must never be presented. Which means you can't even have your hero be a cop who's fighting illegal drug traffic. You cannot show it at all. 4, and remember, this is as Prohibition is almost over. The use of liquor in American life, when not required by the plot or for proper characterization, will not be shown. Which means, if there's no reason for it, your characters can't drink. Nobody just kind of casually has a drink in a Code movie. Next slide, please. Section 2. Yeah, no training day. Sex. The sanctity of the institution of marriage and the home shall be upheld. Pictures shall not infer that low forms of sex relationship are the accepted or common thing. Number 1.
That's probably been for until more modern, even after Code ended, probably more modern times.
So the thing is this explicitly bans extramarital sex of any kind. And we may not show it all the time in modern movies. How much we show it depends on a lot of different factors. But we imply it a whole lot. And somebody doing a biopic of me during the Code would have to have me marry my partner, because you could not show that we're unmarried. That was forbidden, even if it was historically accurate. This is another place where, if you know things, biopics during the Code get very weird. All of these people's lives change a whole lot. There's I think it was Cole Porter had a biopic done of him starring Cary Grant, and he was fascinated by what they made of his life, because he was alive to see it. He's like, no, for one thing, I'm very gay. Hi. So yeah, adultery, sometimes necessary plot material, must not be explicitly treated or justified or presented attractively. Nobody is allowed to have a good time in adultery. 2, scenes of passion. A, they should not be introduced when not essential to the plot. No kissing, unless you have to. B, excessive and lustful kissing, lustful embraces, suggestive postures and gestures are not to be shown. You can have a quick peck on the lips. I think the first French kiss was in Splendor in the Grass in the 1960s.
So mainly just cheek kissing.
Yeah. People are allowed to kiss on the mouth as long as they do it very quickly and not for, they can't look like they're having a good time. C, in general, passion should so be treated that these scenes do not stimulate the lower and baser element. Nobody's allowed to be aroused by your movie. Yeah, Gigi's, I don't remember exactly, but it's in the 60s. So, yeah. So you can't, Roger Ebert used to say that one of the most important factors when judging a sexy movie that nobody ever talked about was whether they made the audience horny. And code movies, the answer is no, they're not allowed to. Next slide, please. Seduction or rape. A, they should never be more than suggested and only when essential for the plot, and even then never shown by explicit method. B, they are never the proper subject for comedy. And I will grant you that it is hard to imagine it's certainly a non-dark comedy about rape, but seduction comedies are hilarious, ask Shakespeare. 4, sex perversion or any inference to it is forbidden. That means no gay people. That is what sex perversion means in this context. Now, there would be a lot of characters over the decades who were implied or suggested, but if Joe Breen could tell they were gay, that was out the window. Fortunately, and we'll get to this when it comes to language, Joe Breen didn't always understand a lot of things. My favorite Maltese Falcon story is coming up when we start talking about the use of words, because it's hilarious and shows that as long as you were smarter than the censor, no, they wouldn't have allowed children. They didn't allow child marriage in the movies. This was an era where child marriage was, I mean, Disney movies are their own whole thing. And to be fair, no one in the movie ever says how old Snow White is. That's all people talking outside the movie. But if we're talking live action, child brides were forbidden. They would even age up historical figures if that was implied.
In the movies, in real life, I think. In real life, however, I think it's child brides.
In real life, that got kind of weird. But it is true that the 1950s, which is the tail end of the code, had some of the lowest marriage age, really, in U.S. history. And that was, 18 or 19 was the average age of marriage. But this is, Shirley Temple was never married. Not in movies, anyway. She did have a romance with Cary Grant in a movie, or at least she was trying to, and he was all hot for Myrna Loy in The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer. But no, Shirley Temple does not get married as a child in her movies. So yeah, number 5, white slavery shall not be treated, which is, again, no sex work. Number 6 actually makes it explicit. Miscegenation, sex relationships between the white and black races is forbidden. Now, it says white and black. However, in practice, it didn't just mean white and black. There were 2 stars around that era. Setsue Hayakawa was going to have problems in the U.S. no matter what around that time because he was Japanese. But Anna May Wong was Chinese. And her career was really damaged by the fact that she was not allowed to have romantic relationships on screen with white co-stars. Yeah, number 9 still holds up. We'll get to it in a minute. It was... Latin lovers were a whole big thing, but they were white enough. If you see what I'm saying, somebody who actually came across as a lower to middle class Mexican would not be as acceptable under the code as, say, Cesar Romero. So yeah, there it is. Fourth wall break would be fine, provided you were careful about what you said when you broke the fourth wall. As long as it passed the code, you could break the fourth wall all you wanted to. There are a few code movies that involve fourth wall breaks, Eddie. 7, sex hygiene and venereal disease are not subjects for motion pictures. Not even they can't be, they're just not. 8, scenes of actual childbirth and factor and silhouette are never to be presented, which is why Gone with the Wind gets very, very weird at the major plot point of Melanie giving birth. And yeah, number 9, children's sex organs are never to be exposed, is the only one that holds up. I'm still fine with number 9 under section 2, sex. Next slide, please. Vulgarity, and this is the whole thing. This is it. The treatment of low, disgusting, unpleasant, though not necessarily evil subjects should always be subject to the dictates of good taste and a regard for the sensibilities of the audience. It's so ill-defined, and so just like, if I don't like it, then we shall not have it in the movies. Next slide, please.
All right. We are.
Number 4. It'd be right back was.
Did I miss one?
No, this is it. Obscenity. Obscenity in word, gesture, reference, song, joke, or by suggestion, even when likely to be understood only by part of the audience, is forbidden. Yeah, exactly, Pimple-Punk. Good taste is whatever Joe Breen says it is. So, in the movie The Maltese Falcon, classic movie, highlight of cinema, Humphrey Bogart, Peter Lorre, Sidney Greenstreet, great movie. The character played by Elisha Cook Jr. is referred to. He has a name. His name is like Wilmer or something, but it doesn't matter. What they call him is the Gunsel. And they call him this repeatedly. And so Joe Breen gets it. He does not know what the word Gunsel means, and he assumes that it means gunman. And that's not what the word Gunsel means. The writers of The Maltese Falcon slipped in a slang term that means young male sex worker. Because that's what they're calling Elisha Cook Jr.'s character all through The Maltese Falcon. But because the censors didn't know what that word meant, they got away with it. So if you're ever watching a Code era movie and you hear a slang term and you think to yourself, wait a minute, I know what that word means. Yeah, that's because the censors didn't. Next slide, please. Profanity. We've had this one that was in the pre-code stuff. It's pretty much word for word here. No swearing. Don't even think about it.
Like what is this? Like, what was it? Second or third commandment or something like that?
Yeah, well, which commandment it is depends on whether you're Catholic or Protestant. But yes. Yeah, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord in vain. Oh, yeah, I can ignore that. Yeah, Easter eggs even back then. If you knew what you were looking for, there were all kinds of stuff hidden. Next slide, please. Number 6, costume. Complete nudity is never permitted. This includes nudity in factor and silhouette, or any lecherous or licentious notice thereof by other characters in the picture. You can't even be off-screen watching somebody and leering at them. Number 2, undressing scenes should be avoided and never used, save where essential to the plot. Though there is a really good one in How the West Was Won, but I'm pretty sure that's post-code. I'd have to look it up. Number 3, indecent or undue exposure is forbidden. Number 4, dancing or costumes intended to permit undue exposure or indecent movements in the dance are forbidden. No bumps and grinds. What's amazing is there's a code movie called Lady of Burlesque, and it is based on a book called The G-String Murders by stripper Gypsy Rose Lee. They weren't even allowed to use her name in advertising because everybody knew who she was. She was a very, very famous stripper in the 40s and 50s. The movie Gypsy, the Stephen Sondheim musical, is about her life. And it is set at a burlesque house. And there is nothing that you could not wear to Sunday brunch with your mom in that movie. It is amazing. Next slide, please.
All right. We have now reached the halfway point of the slides.
Yay! Yeah, I know it's a lot of slides, but rather than try to figure out how to pair these onto, I was just like, each one is going to get its own. I don't even care. Dances. Dances suggesting or representing sexual actions or indecent passions are forbidden. Dances which emphasize indecent movements are to be regarded as obscene.
So, so like the Elvis dance in the 50s.
Yeah, like how the first time I believe Elvis went on TV, he was shown from the waist down, and it was the second time that they were like, no. Yeah, Lady of Burlesque, Barbara Stanwyck gets a musical number, and she's just kind of wandering around the stage. She's not bumping and grinding or anything. Arguably, it also violates the rule about how you can't have references that only part of the audience will get, because the name of the song she's singing is Take It Off the E String, Play It on the G String. But, you know.
You probably can, I'm guessing you probably can say the word G-string.
Yeah, well, you know, in theory, she's talking about the string on the musical instrument.
Oh, that G-string.
But the title of the book is the other kind of G-string. Oh, yeah, no, zombie movies are... there is a Code era movie called I Married a Zombie, but it's not the modern version of Zombie. It's the classic Caribbean version of Zombie, and it's kind of an adaptation of Jane Eyre. It's really good. But crime pays, and nobody's eating brains or anything like that, because that's Romero, which is in the 60s. So, yeah. So, zombie movies, Eddie, would very much violate pretty much all of this. Next slide, please. Religion. No film or episode may throw ridicule on any religious faith. Ministers of religion, in their character as ministers of religion, should not be used as comic characters or as villains. So no Hunchback. 3, ceremonies of any definite religion should be carefully and respectfully handled. And you know, I'm honestly okay with number 3.
Now, question. When they say ridicule of faith, do they mean all religion or just the Christian, the two main Christian faiths?
So, officially they mean all religion. I suspect that had you presented certain minority religions, let's just say I think Doc Facilier from The Princess and the Frog would have been a perfectly acceptable villain under the Code, even though he is arguably a minister of a religion. Because Santeria and Voodoo don't count. Now, in practice, you just didn't see a lot of the minority religions. They just didn't talk about them. And by minority religion, let's be very clear, I mean in the United States. I mean, in the United States, that's anything that isn't Christian. And frankly, even some Christian faiths were just not brought up during the era of the Code. there are vanishingly few movies during the code that even would have acknowledged that Mormons existed, for example. Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, a lot of the other smaller sects of Christianity would not have come up in the code era. Frankly, even the Orthodox faiths were fairly unlikely to come up. You'd be very, very careful about Judaism, which did come up sometimes because, of course it did. Islam was not talked about much. Buddhism was not talked about much. Hinduism was not talked about much. Native American religions would probably be shown in a not great light. But that's okay because that's not really religion anyway, right? Right. So the official stance of the code is non-denominational. Officially, that is religion, full stop. In practice, the less familiar the religion gets to the majority of audiences, the grayer an area it gets. Again, I'm still fine with number 3. Like, there's no reason for you to do a movie that makes fun of a bar mitzvah. Either you can do funny scenes in a bar mitzvah, ask the Coens, but
yeah,
this is something that's really important to some people. There's no reason to be a jerk about it.
I was wondering about that since you mentioned earlier he was an anti-Semitic, so I don't know if that.
Yeah, again, it mostly just didn't come up. But when it did, Judaism was entitled to the same respect officially as Christianity as far as religion goes. There's another Coen Brothers movie called Hail Caesar, which is set during 1950s Hollywood. And it's in part about the making of this huge biblical epic. And the studio gets a team of religious advisors to make sure they're not offending anyone. And the scene where the religious advisors are discussing the scene in question is hilarious because it points out that you cannot have a consensus view of these things. Great. The Coens are fantastic.
Did the 10 Commandments come out during the code era?
I believe it is just at the tail end of the code. I would have to look it up. That's 1950s, I'm pretty sure. So, yeah, there's a whole slew of biblical epics that are getting made at the last few years of the code. And they got away with a certain amount more because it was to show how evil people were. Again, this is while the code was in the process of dying, so yeah. But also Cecil B. DeMille had tried that one during the 20s. It was like, no, I'm showing naked dancers to prove how evil things are. I was like, no, Cecil, that's not what you're doing. You fool no one. The treatment of bedrooms must be governed by good taste and delicacy. That's it. And that's all under locations. The minister is not always a good guy, Eddie, but he is at the very worst neutral. You can have a minister show up for one scene, marry the main couple, and go away again. You can have, a priest performing the funeral and never be seen again, whatever. But the minister cannot be a villain. You cannot be making fun of the minister. And yeah, bedrooms, be careful. National feelings. The use of the flag shall be consistently respectful. The history, institutions, prominent people, and citizenry of other nations shall be represented fairly. Now, that fairly is doing a lot of work.
I am surprised at number 2, especially in this time of the thing.
Well, what you have to remember is that was very much about Europe. This is not really thinking outside. The farthest east they're going to get is Stalin.
So no Africa or Asia.
No Africa, no Asia, no Central South America. Maybe Australia, but yeah. Really what this means is don't piss off the German market. At the time the code was instituted, that is what number 2 means. It means don't lose the German market. And Joe Breen may not have fully disapproved of the regime over there, which is a whole other thing, but he didn't institute the wording of the code himself. And there were studio leaders who agreed with him, even Jewish ones who agreed, let's keep the German market. There were some who didn't, there were some who did. It's not a black and white issue. Except in as much as it is a black and white issue that the German market is not as important as the actual lives of people being killed in Germany at the time, but, you know. As far as what people were saying and doing, it's not a black and white issue. And when World War II started, well, caricaturing, you know, Admiral Tojo and various prominent Germans and whatever, that's fair, because they're the enemy now. So yeah, fairly is doing a lot of lifting. Next slide, please. Salacious, indecent, or obscene titles shall not be used. There are a few titles from that era that I was very, very surprised to discover, but by and large, you can't even imply a dirty joke in your titles. Next slide. Repellent subjects. The following subjects must be treated within the careful limits of good taste. And this is a lot of the same stuff as in the pre-code stuff, you know, third-degree methods and brutality and branding, and you can show this stuff. As since I read it once, we'll just kind of, you know, take it as read again, because I think it's in places word for word. So yeah, next slide. You can show all this, just be careful, respectful. So this picture, this was taken by a photographer who intended to show as many violations of the code in one picture as he could. So if you note the police hat, that guy's a cop, so that's the law defeated. We see the inside of her thigh, we see lace lingerie, he's dead, there's narcotics and drinking, her bosom is not fully, but exposed by code standards. There's cards, so that's gambling. She's pointing a gun at him, and there's a Tommy gun. This picture by itself violates 10 parts of the code.
Is a Tommy gun floating in the air?
No, the Tommy gun is resting on his head.
Very good balancing act.
Yeah, well, you know, presumably he's not moving around a whole lot since theoretically he's dead. Next slide, please. So later revisions. After World War II, we got some changes to the code. And the numbers got all changed around, and I wasn't able to find a copy of the revised code. So I don't know what the number changes would have looked like if you had the whole thing on paper. But, so number 3, the illegal drug traffic must not be portrayed, etc., etc., or became, the illegal drug traffic must not be portrayed in such a way as to stimulate curiosity concerning the use of or traffic in such drugs, nor shall scenes be approved which show the use of illegal drugs or their effects in detail. And then after 51, it went back to a flat ban. And then in 56, it was drug addiction or the illicit traffic in addiction-producing drugs shall not be shown if their portrayal A, tends in any manner to encourage, stimulate, or justify the use of such drugs, or B, stresses, visually or by dialogue, their temporary attractive effects. You can't show what it feels like to get high. Or C, stresses that the drug habit may be quickly or easily broken. Or D, shows details of drug procurement or of the taking of drugs in any manner. Or E, emphasizes the profits of the drug traffic. Or F, involves children who are shown knowingly to use or traffic in drugs. Which is a little, it's better. Because this actually does allow a little bit more nuance. But it's still,
But I think around, I don't think it has anything to do with the code, but I think around this time, another Joseph was attacking the movie industry.
Yeah. McCarthy, I don't think was able to. I mean, he was able to get a whole lot of people kicked out of Hollywood. And that is, I'd love to talk about McCarthyism in the movies one of these days. But he didn't, so far as I know, get a lot of changes made to the code. But it looks to me as though they were like,
Probably the only thing he would have done, I'm guessing, would be like no positive mention of communism in the movies.
Yeah, well, that was basically an unspoken rule anyway, but it was definitely when McCarthy was big, you were not allowed to show communism in any kind of positive way, and a whole bunch of people lost their careers. And it's I'm not saying the movie Trumbo is good necessarily, though I kind of like it, but it does cover a lot of that era if you just want a quick and dirty view of it. Next slide, please. Stories on the kidnapping or illegal abduction of children are acceptable under the code only when A, when the subject is handled with restraint and discretion and avoids details, gruesomeness, and undue horror, and B, the child is returned unharmed. Which means now you can make an adaptation of The Ransom of Red Chief, but anything where the kid gets killed is fully unacceptable. Yeah, just like how certain anime have pink-colored blood, or the Ninja Turtles weren't allowed to use ninja weapons in the UK, I think. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of weird restrictions because of what people were and weren't allowed to show. Next slide, please. Brutality. Excessive and inhuman acts of cruelty and brutality shall not be presented. This includes all detailed and protracted presentation of physical violence, torture, and abuse. This really spelled out what we mean by brutality, which had been left really vague for a really long time. And this is another one where I'm like, I'm not 100% opposed to this, because I don't think you really need to show that, but I'm also aware that there are people who like those movies.
So, yeah, I am definitely not. I am not a slasher fan.
Yeah. I have not seen a single Saw movie. The subject of abortion shall be discouraged, shall never be more than suggested, and when referred to shall be condemned. It must never be treated lightly or made the subject of a comedy. So Juno is right out. Abortion shall never be shown explicitly or by inference, and a story must not indicate that an abortion has been performed. The word abortion shall not be used. American attitudes towards the subject of abortion have been in a great deal of change over the last century or so. In the 19th century, abortion was a lot more common than people realize. In the 20th century, the Catholics started being openly opposed to it, and the evangelicals joined along in the 70s when they realized they could make it into a popular issue. So this is writing on that sort of change in attitudes. 5, the methods and techniques of prostitution and white slavery shall never be presented in detail. White slavery actually is probably closer to what we call human trafficking. But explicitly, they only care about the white people. Shall never be presented in detail, nor shall the subjects be presented unless shown in contrast to right standards of behavior. So, bad girl in a Western can be contrasted with the school marm, but yeah. Brothels and any clear identification as such may not be shown, which is why dance hall girls are never shown doing anything more than dancing in Westerns. Next slide. Miscegenation, sex relationship between the white and black races, is forbidden, became sex perversion, or any inference to it is forbidden, became restraint and care shall be exercised in presentations dealing with sex aberrations. So they reclassified miscegenation as one of the sex perversions. And then there started being movies coming out about how, maybe life was hard for black people and some lighter-skinned black people wanted to pass, and that's a whole big thing, and so they changed the rules to make those movies more acceptable. Mm-hmm. Next slide. Ban on childbirth was removed in 1956. But you were allowed to lift up a newborn baby, which is why this provision shall not apply to infants. If the baby is still all covered in goo and has an umbilical cord, you may show its privates. Or presumably if you're changing a diaper, which Joe Breen had retired by this point, so they were allowed to do again.
Yeah, I think it was in the 80s, Full House, they showed baby Michelle's butt in the first episode. They were spraying her off.
Yeah, wouldn't surprise me. Next slide. Okay, the vulgarity rule. I copy this mostly because I love this list. It became pointed profanity and every other profane or vulgar expression, however used, is forbidden. 1. No approval by the Production Code Administration shall be given to the use of words and phrases in motion pictures, including, but not limited to, the following. Alley cat, applied to a woman. Bat, applied to a woman. Broad, applied to a woman. Bronx cheer, the sound. Chippy, cocotte. God, Lord, Jesus Christ, unless used reverently. Cripes. Fanny. Fairy, in a vulgar sense. Finger, thee. Fire, cries of. God. Goose, in a vulgar sense. Hold your hat or hats. I love that one. Hot, applied to a woman. In your hat, which I don't even know what that one means. Louse, lousy. Madam, relating to prostitution. Nance. Nerts, nuts, except when meaning crazy. Pansy. Raspberry, the sound. Slut, applied to a woman. SOB, son of a. Tart, toilet gags. Tomcat, applied to a man. Traveling salesman and farmer's daughter jokes. Whore, damn, hell, excepting when the use of said two last words shall be essential and required for portrayal in proper historical context of any scene or dialogue based upon historical fact or folklore, or for the presentation in proper literary context of a biblical or other religious quotation, or a quotation from a literary work, provided that no such use shall be permitted, which is intrinsically objectionable or offends good taste.
So as long as you're talking about the factual hell, it's okay. Right.
But if you are talking about the place, you can use hell and damn. But even there, you have to be tasteful. Which is why the first Disney villain to use the word hell is Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty. Just before she turns into the dragon that you see in my picture there, she says, "Now you will face me and all the powers of hell." And she's talking about the place. That's a painting my partner did of a stuffed Maleficent that I've had since high school. So yeah, so that is quite the list. The fact that you can't say hold on to your hats just delights me. And then in 1956, it became vulgar expressions and double meanings having the same effect of forbidden. This shall include, but not be limited to, such words and expressions as chippy, fairy, goose, nuts, pansy, SOB, son of a. The treatment of low, disgusting, unpleasant, though not necessarily evil, subjects should be guided always by the dictates of good taste and a proper regard for the sensibilities of the audience. Which I always want to read in that really upper crust voice. Let us not be vulgar. Next slide. For 1939, the following words and phrases are invariably deleted by political censor boards. Bum in England, bloody in England, sissy or sissy in England, gigolo in England, poisons, specific names of, in the United States, punk in England, because punk in the early years of the 20th century had, let's say it's a synonym for gunsel and move on. Sex appeal in England, sex life in England, shag in the British Empire, shyster in England, stick 'em up in the United States and Canada.
So, shag in British Empire. So, I guess another one's Scotland or Wales that can be used, but not in England.
Well, I mean, British Empire in 1939 presumably would have covered all of Great Britain, but would be India, Australia. I don't remember when Canada formally split off.
But yeah, it was still a big deal in the 30s.
Yeah. So that was added, and it was followed by a list of specifically banned slurs that I just decided you didn't need to see. I mean, some of them were fairly obvious. You know, you couldn't put in the N-word. That was actually in the code. Which, again, I'm okay with that.
I like the last one, so there would be no bank robber movies.
Yeah, you couldn't phrase it stick 'em up. You could demand people to put their hands up, but you had to say it in those words. I will say that the list of banned slurs is interesting for what it does and doesn't cover. There's I mean, given it was 1939, any slur about Japanese people was pretty much considered just fine. But a few of the slurs that were forbidden were, you couldn't say frog to refer to a French person. Which I just found fascinating. Because it looked so, I hesitate to use the word in connection with a racial slur, but it looked so innocent compared to some of the rest of the list. Like, really? We're taking the time to care about that? Okay. It's I'm not going to say go look it up, but if you feel like looking it up, it's a weird assortment of racial slurs. Next slide, please.
All right.
The dance section and the location section were removed in 1956, and what was added was number 9, special subjects. The following subjects must be treated with discretion and restraint within the careful limits of good taste. 1, bedroom scenes. 2, hangings and electrocutions. 3, liquor and drinking. 4, surgical operations and childbirth. And 5, third-degree methods. So you were allowed to have bedroom scenes, you just had to be very, very careful about them. This line was added to national feelings. 3, no picture shall be produced that tends to incite bigotry or hatred among peoples of differing races, religions, or national origins. Which,
Again, I'm surprised about that. Around this time.
I mean, that's 56, so that's after World War II and after the Holocaust, and, fairly importantly, after Joe Breen retired.
Yeah.
But it is,
I think it's at the beginning of the civil rights movement.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got, gosh, 56. I didn't specifically look it up, but you've got marches going, you've got boycotts going.
I think 54 was the Brown Topeka case. I think.
Yeah. Um.
But even then, the South was still.
Yeah. No. Little Rock 9, I want to say, was under Eisenhower. I know at least the beginnings of integration was under Eisenhower. So, yeah. And I mean, even though the film industry was based in California, in Los Angeles in particular, where surely you would think they would be aware that there are more than two ethnic backgrounds in the United States, it's still very much focused on black people and white people.
Oh, I was thinking that, but yeah, that one movie was definitely that Wilson showed in the White House. I forget what it was called.
Oh yeah, Birth of a Nation. Yeah, that's 1919, I believe. So
pre-code.
Well, pre-code. That's a silent movie. It's actually hand tinted in places. So yeah, that was, you couldn't remake Birth of a Nation under this section, and oh darn. Next slide, please. Titles became salacious, indecent, or obscene titles shall not be used. Titles which suggest or are currently associated in the public mind with material, characters, or occupations unsuitable for the screen. Titles which are otherwise objectionable. Basically, if we don't like it, which became titles which are salacious, blah, 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 and titles which violate any other clause of this code. So the collapse of the code. We start with 1952, which is when Joseph Burstyn Inc. v. Wilson overturns the mutual decision and declares film to be art in 1952, and as art makes it protectable by the First Amendment, which means national censorship is no longer on the table. The whole reason for the code was the fear of national censorship. National censorship would not happen with films declared art. What anything not covered? Yeah, no, it's amazing. Then Joe Breen retires in 54, which brings to the major post-war code revision. And then those C-rated films, the condemned films by the Legion of Decency, start getting more popular because the Legion does not go away. And even some movies that are passed by the code are still getting B and C ratings from the Legion of Decency.
So again, C would have been NC-17 today, or
yeah, yeah. The thing is what Joe Breen really wanted was for all movies to be appropriate for all audiences, which is ridiculous. And I'm speaking as a parent here. There are movies I watch with my kids that are fully appropriate for them on any, including a lot of code movies, honestly, on any reasonable level. There's nothing in these movies that my kids would object to. And they won't watch them because they think they're boring. I don't think there's much of anything in Good Night and Good Luck, which is the movie that George Clooney made about Joe McCarthy, that would violate the code. Maybe one or two things, but not much. And certainly there's really pretty much nothing in it that I would object to showing my children. But they wouldn't watch it because they don't care. The movie is boring. So why would it have to be appropriate to them? A lot of the movies I watch, it's not at their maturity level. And if it's not at their maturity level, who cares if it's got dirty words in it? They're not watching it. So yeah. So these C-rated movies were starting to get more popular because, among other things, returning servicemen were like, after everything I saw overseas, who cares if I hear somebody say hell in a non-place name context? And then foreign movies, which of course were not covered by the code because the code strictly limited United States film production and distribution, started getting more American distribution. There's an early Ingmar Bergman movie called Summers with Monica, which I have.
So, like movies that the troops might have been seen in Europe were allowed to come up over the United States now.
Well, not just that, but post-war Europe was going through a lot of changes in what they were making in the way of movies. France started doing a lot of very interesting stuff to do with crime movies. There's some really good French caper movies from the 40s and 50s. In Italy, they were getting to a thing called neorealism, which was very much like inexperienced actors, and let's try to show what people's real lives are like. Some great movies came out of that. What I was saying is, in like the early 50s, I think, Ingmar Bergman, one of his first movies is called Summers with Monica, and it is, with all the love in my heart for one of the great directors of the 20th century, it is the next best thing to softcore porn. So there were all kinds of movies that were getting made as kind of a reaction to these people who had lived in Europe through World War II. Like, terrible person. But Roman Polanski was making some really fascinating movies in Poland at the time. You know, Poland, which had been under Nazi occupation, and then after the war ended was now under Soviet occupation, and there's a lot of stuff going on with Polish film and with Czech film dealing with how they're reacting to literal decades of occupation. And some of these movies are starting to filter back to the United States.
Was that the one from the Manson murder?
Yes. Yeah. Roman Polanski is a terrible person, and I want to be very, very clear that I believe he should die in prison because that 13-year-old girl said no, and he gave her drugs, and it's a whole thing. It was not statutory, it was just flat out. But you can't deny, if you have watched his movies, that the man is capable of making a pretty good movie.
So he was the Bill Cosby of his time?
Yes. Yes. I mean, their times overlap. To my knowledge, Roman Polanski only ever... Roman Polanski's numbers are considerably smaller. I've heard 2 or 3 other people besides the woman he was theoretically supposed to go to prison for what he did to her, but nothing like the number of assaults that Bill Cosby has committed.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about how people, famous actors or characters you grew up watching, are like, wow, these guys are assholes.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. The assault that Roman Polanski should be in prison for took place at Jack Nicholson's house. Now, Jack Nicholson wasn't home at the time, let me be clear. But it was at Jack Nicholson's house, and that's just weird to think about. I rewatched the Michael Keaton Batman this week. It's like, oh yeah! Hi, Jack! Weird things.
But not just sex things too, realism too. Like I grew up watching Growing Pains and Hercules, and that was there. Like
and Kirk Cameron and Kevin Sorbo are yeah, Scott Baio, I believe, is on that list. Is that Scott Baio?
Well, I think it was his. But
yeah, but there are a whole bunch of people. Chuck Norris is crazy. Yeah, there are a whole bunch of people where it's like, well, you've certainly gone places. Like anyone who was a fan of Smallville the woman who played
Chloe, I think.
Yeah, she got involved in a cult, so that's a thing. Yeah, no. But these foreign movies were able to touch all kinds of subjects that were forbidden under the code. There's a really good one, I think it's called Blackmail, about a man who is being blackmailed because of a male lover he has had. And these movies were starting to get US distribution, despite the fact that, of course, they did not have code seals because they didn't have to. And then movies started getting released without code seals that were made by the major studios for years. I don't know if you've seen Some Like It Hot.
I have not.
Oh, it's a great movie. It's a comedy. It's set in like 1929. It's Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon play jazz musicians, and they walk into a garage in Chicago in the 1920s. And it's not Al Capone, it's a fictional detective, but they basically witnessed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And to get out of town, they pose as women to join an all-girl band that's going to be performing in Florida. So they are in drag for a good 3/4 of the movie. Tony Curtis's character falls in love with Marilyn Monroe, who's the singer. Jack Lemmon's character gets hit on by a millionaire who believes that Jack Lemmon is actually a woman. At one point, Tony Curtis is trying to point out to Jack Lemmon how, by the standards of the 50s, insane this is. And he says, "You're a guy. Why would a guy want to marry another guy?" And Jack Lemmon, without missing a beat, says, "Security." And I mean, it's a hilarious movie, but the entire Jack Lemmon plotline is predicated on the fact that he is a man being courted by another man. And yes, there are some jokes about it that don't age well, but the movie ends. I'm going to give away the ending because it is one of the funniest ending lines in the history of film. They're escaping for reasons. There's a lot of plot I'm not going to give, but Joey Brown, the actor who plays a millionaire, he's driving this boat, and Tony Curtis and Marilyn Monroe are making out the backseat of the boat. And Jack Lemmon is still in drag. And he's trying to explain to this guy why he can't marry him. And finally, he takes off his wig. He says, "Oh, man, I'm going to level with you. Oh, man." And the guy says, "Well, nobody's perfect." And that's the end of the movie. And for years, I was like, how in the name of God did this movie get made? Because that character is bi, just canonically now. It's like, I don't care, I'm marrying you anyway. Like, how? It turns out it was released without a code seal. Which I didn't know until I was doing my research for this. Released without a code seal.
Now,
Huh?
say, would a code seal be like the equivalent of, I'll say the same equivalent, like old Nintendo games had that Nintendo seal on them?
Yeah. You could not release a movie in the United States for a considerable length of time without a seal saying that your movie had gone through the production office. And with Some Like It Hot, the studio's like, meh. There's a MASH episode, about trying to get good movies at their unit, where they're looking for a movie called The Moon is Blue. Oh yeah, no, Some Like It Hot is a great movie. It's enormously funny. Tony Curtis does the most fantastic Cary Grant impersonation when he's trying to convince Marilyn Monroe that he's a millionaire. It's so funny. But there's a MASH episode where they're trying to get This is an actual historical movie that came out during the Korean War, so like 52, I want to say. It's called The Moon is Blue. It's by director Otto Preminger. And it's about a woman who's trying to play two of her boyfriends off one another. I haven't actually seen it, but it's banned because it uses the word virgin. And Otto convinced the studio to release it anyway, even though the code would not pass this movie. And from then on throughout the 50s, basically Otto Preminger made movie after movie that was designed to take down the code. The Man with the Golden Arm, which is it stars Frank Sinatra, and it's a movie about drug addiction. That's an Otto Preminger movie. You know,
real fast. Let's talk about it real fast. Let's gotta say, I think about the time watching the reruns, but now I think about it, it's like, how did they get 11 years worth of seasons in the 3 years? The
timeline of MASH makes absolutely no sense. They celebrate at least 4 Christmases over the course of that show. It's wild. But, The Moon is Blue was released without a code seal, and it's the plot of an episode of MASH, because they find out that there's a movie that was banned, and then they find out that they think it's really boring anyway. But all of these things were starting to break down the code. I think we've got another slide.
One more.
Right. So, when the code collapsed, what it was initially replaced with was G, M, R, and X. G is general audiences, M is mature, R is restricted, and X, which they did not trademark, was adult content.
Even worse than restricted.
Yeah. Restricted meant that, theoretically, I could take my kids to an R-rated movie. I'm not gonna, but I could.
So X is probably straight up porn at that point.
Well, that was the thing. It was not intended to be straight up porn.
Okay.
I have seen, and it's what we call it now, is NC-17. I have seen an NC-17 movie in the theater. Admittedly, there's a lot of nudity in the one that I saw. I saw Shane with Michael Fassbender. And it's about sex addiction. And it has a plot, and it has a very deep, it's not just Michael Fassbender having sex with a lot of people, though it is Michael Fassbender having sex with a lot of people. But that's not all it is. There's a movie called The Killing of Sister George that was released. It could not get an R rating. It was released with an X rating because it is about lesbians. It is a fairly... I won't say what it would be released under today. PG-13 or R at the most. And it is an X-rated movie simply because of its subject matter. But they didn't trademark the X because they figured that people would want to apply that to their own movies. And that meant that porn started using the X, and then they used triple X and, all of the what have you, and just adding more X's to make it look like their movies were dirtier and dirtier and dirtier. And it became a completely useless designation. It didn't tell you, a movie that was related X, despite having decent subject matter, was in the same category as the filthiest porn you can imagine. So that was the problem with the X. And then they switched from M to PG, which is parental guidance. And then I'm sure you can remember back the days when they added the PG-13. The whole, Gremlins, Temple of Doom. These movies were being released as a PG, and they are graphic. But they weren't quite up to R.
Yeah, I went to see the Gremlins when I was 4 or 5, and I freaked out during half.
Yeah.
I believed in the middle of the movie because I was so scared.
Yeah, and that's why they added PG-13, was to prevent that kind of thing. And then in the early 90s, they put in the NC-17, which is no children under 17.
So, like, well, if you have an adult, you could be there. But
yeah, like I said, I can take my kids to an R movie. I cannot take my kids to an NC-17 movie because they would not be allowed in. Technically, there's no legal enforcement of that. But in practical terms...
Like, ID, please. Your kids, like, ID.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, no. Well, Temple of Doom, a friend of mine and I actually have a way that we could make a much better movie out of it by cutting out all of the racism. But, yeah. Temple of Doom is a really horrific movie if you're a little kid. I don't think we show that one to my kids. At home, it's a much calmer, safer viewing experience.
But you want them to see the guy grab his heart out of his chest and...
Yeah, that's Temple of Doom. Ke Kwan doing some excellent acting in that movie. When he's trying to get through to Indy, it's the best acting in the movie. I will die on this hill. So happy that man is an Oscar winner. But
so what years? You don't have years on these things. So what years were each of these things made?
So I'd have to look it up again. The GMRX started in about the 60s.
All right.
Then it switched to PG, I believe, in the 70s. PG-13, as I recall, is 86 thereabouts. And that's the first change that I personally remember. And then NC-17 is like 1990, give or take. The first NC-17 movie is Henry and June, I believe, starring Ralph Fiennes.
So, what's the difference between the first one, between M and R?
M is basically, this is going to have some scarier content, than G, But there's a limit to how many times you can swear. That is one of the distinctions. There's some words, if you use them once, it's automatically an R. Some words, you get a couple of usages of it. The thing is, the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA, was the people who do the ratings, and they have not released a list. Officially, nobody knows. The rating system in the United States is a black box. You put movie in, rating comes out the other end. Oh, Boys Don't Cry was, they fought really hard for the R for Boys Don't Cry. But again, the documentary, This Film Is Not Yet Rated, talks a lot more about the rating system. And one of the things it makes clear is that content that would be a PG if it was between a man and a woman becomes a PG-13 if it's between two men or two women. If it's PG-13, it becomes an R. Like, same-sex content is rated as being worse for what rating you get than heterosexual content, which is unacceptable. And again, speaking as a parent here, I am just as concerned about my kids seeing sex scenes between a man and a woman as I am between two men or two women, or non-binary people or whatever. That is... But what really makes me angry about it is studio movies are usually rated lower than the same content is from an independent movie. The hardest R-rated movie I have ever seen, where there was the movie where I was sitting there thinking, why is this not NC-17, was Watchmen. Saw this movie in the theater. There is swearing, there is nudity, there is sex, there is violence. A guy gets his head smashed into a toilet until the toilet breaks in this movie. This movie is graphic on every level, but it's a big budget studio production and it was R. In my household, the movies are actually divided into 3 categories because I have a lot of movies that predate their rating system on DVD, so that's a thing. But they are movies that kids can watch alone, movies the kids can watch with me or their dad, and movies that the kids can't watch. And the joke is the last 2 movies that are going to be left sitting alone on the movies the kids can't watch shelf are going to be Watchmen and Secretary. Secretary is a beautiful, sweet, charming, romantic comedy about BDSM. And I'm not having that conversation with my children anytime soon. And they don't want to have it with me, so we're all good. It's a great movie. I love it. But, yeah. I don't actually know what it's rated. I don't think there's much graphic to it. But I'm still not having the conversation. So right now, I can think of a bunch of ways we could improve the rating system. Transparency would be a nice place to start. In theory, everyone who is on the MPAA ratings board is a parent, and that is not actually true. I would like to have not just parents, but same-sex couple parents on the board. Throw that out there. And I do like that it started listing, this is rated this way because of fantasy violence and what have you. But, as flawed as the rating system is, it is still better than the code.
Yeah, so like I said, overall, what was your opinion of the code if you had been living back then or today?
The code is, by design, something that eliminates the lived experiences of enormous numbers of people. And yeah, it's more people now than it was at the time it was in place. One of the things I've explained fairly frequently is that it's impossible to say for sure how many single-parent households we have in the United States because everybody's method of counting single-parent households is different. But it is certainly true that we have more households where the parents are not married. Whether they are living together and unmarried, whether they are divorced, whether they are separate, what have you. There are more kids who are growing up with parents who are not married. And that would not be allowed to be shown under the code. You could not have unmarried parents. Certainly, by design, the code could not show the lives of queer people. That was literally against the rules of the code. We just passed Loving Day, the anniversary of the Loving v. Virginia decision, which legalized interracial marriages across the United States. And that was only a handful of years after the downfall of the code. So there were people in some states, but not all, who were married, whose lives could not be shown under the code because one of them was black and one of them was white. It is appalling that we let that happen. And, again, there are 1 or 2 provisions of the code that are fine. Let's not show children's genitals. I'm okay with that. There are some places where it's like, yeah, let's be careful and respectful of this handful of things. I'm okay with that. But requiring all films to be appropriate for all audiences is ridiculous.
Yeah, even movies and TV shows, it took a while for some restrictions, even in present day, to be less restrictive. Like I mentioned this in our Discord chat, like the
Mm-hmm.
Sailor Moon thing. Two lesbians were cousins.
Yeah, yeah. In Sailor Moon, yeah, they couldn't show a lesbian couple in a children's cartoon. One of I don't know if you remember, but I remember when TV ratings were new. That was like the late 80s, early 90s, I want to say. They invented the idea of TV and warning labels on records and all of these things. Whereas, like, maybe instead of banning things, we have a conversation about what's appropriate for who. And, oh, yeah, no, there are a lot of people who want to bring the code back. And every once in a while, you get a person on the left who's like, oh, but it created such challenging, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, if you were a cishet white couple. But if you were anything but a cishet white couple, we just couldn't talk about you.
So how is this similar or different from the code you talked about earlier in the comics?
With the comics code, you mean?
Yeah,
Or
whatever that was called a few months ago. You talked about
the comics. There's a lot of overlap. Very, very famously in the comics, there's a anti-drug abuse plot line that had to be released without the comics code seal because they were forbidden to mention drugs, even as, hey kids, stay off drugs.
Yeah,
and it's the same kind of, I've read Seduction of the Innocent, and it's very clear that all comics need to be appropriate for the smallest child who can read a comic. It's like, why?
Yeah. So, certain TV specials, I don't know if you remember this in the 80s or 90s when it came out, the Cartoon All-Stars movie or episode where they did drugs. They probably wouldn't be able to show it in the code.
Yeah, that was a made for TV, but yeah, where it was your favorite comic or cartoon characters fighting drug addiction would have violated the code. And a lot of the censorship on TV was very similar to censorship that was under the code, to the extent that this was one of the only places where I like William Shatner. William Shatner is, by all accounts, a horrific person to spend any kind of time around. But the Star Trek episode where, under alien mind control, sure, whatever, Kirk and Uhura kiss. They wanted Shatner to record a take where they don't kiss that they could play on TV stations in the South. And Shatner, in one of the only moments I approve of from that man in his entire life, screwed up every single take except once where they kissed. There was no usable take of them not kissing to be shown on racist stations in the South. But that's the thing, like, there was a rule that a white guy could not kiss a black woman. There's a Perry Mason episode where a guy is engaged to a Japanese woman, and I don't think they even hold hands over the course of this episode, and they're engaged. This whole idea of let's limit who can be romantically involved with who and what we can show, and here, crime must pay. This is another one that's big on all three, is you cannot have an ending where somebody gets away with something. And, we've talked about a couple of classics of literature that would be really hard to adapt under the code. Like, how do you end Les Miserables? Because you can't make a mockery of Javert, but the whole point is that Javert is wrong. So what do you do with that? The code was trying to make the code and the comics code and the standards and practices on TV were trying to make the world a black and white place. No shades of gray. Even in the places where it was, well, treat this with care, it was clear that they really wanted to ban those, but you realistically can't. So, you know, it's one of the reasons that the post-war world could not sustain the code, because it's hard to live through something like World War II and come away from it still believing that there are no shades of gray.
So, thank you for talking about this today.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
So you said what's something you want to talk about in the future when we meet again? You said just a few things you had your idea on.
I got a lot of movie subjects that I could talk about. There are other aspects of history that I could. Movie history is my jam. I'm really into movie history. I could talk about post-war film, though that's a little bit niche. I could talk about the escape from Edison and why the studio system is in Hollywood and why it looked the way it did. That's a fun topic that not a lot of people know about. Yeah.
We'll get together on Discord and figure something out then.
Yeah, and if people have something in particular they'd like to hear from me, I'm up for suggestions too.
Say if you have any suggestions, talk in the comments below about movies or comic books or TV shows, ratings or stuff, whatever that you want us to talk about. Put in the comments below right now after the show. Meanwhile, speaking of comments below, next week, me, Landon, Tapioca Weasel, and Ness, we'll be finishing up our Before Earth series with a Q&A. So here's the link to it. If you have any questions you want to ask about the universe before Earth was a thing, click the link and write the comments down below. Put in the comments. And we will answer your questions to the best of our abilities. Well, they will. I'm an idiot when it comes to this stuff. I'm just the host. And then in a week and a half, depending if seat's free or not, me, my friend Snick, and my other friend Eric will be talking about the different eras of the Disney movies, from the golden age of the Snow White to the silver age of Cinderella to the dark age of the Black Cauldron to the Renaissance of Aladdin to whatever movies are today. What the movies are called today. And then finally, in about 3 weeks, give or take, on the first week of July, Dr. Dino will be back talking about the big boys of land, the sword pots. And that is
and he'll be back from his dig then. That'll be interesting.
Yep, and that will be the next few episodes coming up. So if the universe, Disney, and dinosaurs are your thing, come join us.
You can watch the Disney movie Dinosaur, except don't watch the Disney movie Dinosaur.
I did watch Land Before Time back in the day.
Yeah, no, Dinosaur is about 2000 or so, and it's not good.
All right. So anything you want to say? Anything you want to say catchphrase wise coming up that you want to talk about?
Well, I just want to announce real quick that on July 1st, MediaMagpies.com should be launching. That is our new website. Me and a bunch of friends talking about. We'll be doing essays about TV, movies, books, video games, any other pop culture stuff that catches our fancy. That's what the Magpie thing is one of us thinks it's shiny and we write about it.
You want to link it in the chat or link it in the private chat or the public chat?
I'll drop a link in the chat. I'll put it in the private chat because I can't figure. But at least the new site is a lot easier to spell than the one that I've been working on currently. So
Right, here's the link to her thing in chat now.
And we'll be going live July 1st is the current plan.
Right. Knock on wood.
Yep, you get to hear me write about, or you get to read me write about Captain EO. It's very exciting. It's a good dinosaur. That's Pixar. Dinosaur is something different. There are a lot of dinosaur movies out there.
Right. Like I said, we'll see her in a few weeks. Hopefully, you'll see me next week. But as always, never stop learning and enjoy the randomness. We will see you next time.